A woman was found murdered inside her own home. There were clear signs of a violent struggle. Nothing about the scene suggested a random break-in. There was no forced entry, which meant one thing: the person responsible was not a stranger. It was someone she knew. Investigators collected evidence that should have identified them, but no one was arrested, and the truth stayed hidden until the evidence was finally understood decades later. The scene suggested the attacker was not a stranger, and that shaped the investigation immediately. In 1987, in California, Roxanne Wood was found dead inside her apartment. There were clear signs of a violent struggle. This was not controlled and it was not accidental. But there was no forced entry into the apartment. That detail narrowed the possibilities quickly. It meant the person responsible likely had access or was allowed inside. Investigators began focusing on people who knew her. One detail from early interviews did not fully align with the timeline, but at the time, there was nothing to prove it was wrong. Investigators expanded interviews across Roxanne's immediate circle. They focused on individuals who could enter without forcing the door. Statements were collected, but none placed a suspect clearly inside the apartment. The earlier inconsistency remained, but could not be challenged without evidence. Physical evidence suggested close contact, but no suspect matched it. Biological samples had been collected from the scene. At the time, they should have identified the attacker, but the technology needed to do that did not exist. The strongest piece of evidence was already there, but unusable. The investigation slowed, leaving questions that could not yet be answered. As the investigation slowed, the case entered a different phase. It was no longer active. It became a cold case. Years passed without a suspect being identified. The evidence remained preserved, but unused. For the family, the case stayed open without answers. The original questions did not change. Who was inside that apartment? Why had they not been identified? The answer was likely already in the evidence collected at the scene, but at the time, it could not be accessed, and the case remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. Nearly 30 decades later, the case was reopened using new forensic methods. The biological evidence collected in 1987 was tested again with advanced DNA analysis. This time, it produced a usable profile. The same evidence that could not be used before now pointed to a specific individual. When investigators compared the result to earlier statements, a problem appeared. One person's version of events did not align with the DNA. That inconsistency, noted years earlier, was now supported by evidence. What could not be proven at the time was now measurable. The case shifted from unknown to identified in a single step. The question was no longer who, but why it took decades to prove it. The DNA profile led investigators to a specific individual with a prior record. His connection to Roxanne was not random. He had been within her extended circle. This confirmed the earlier suspicion that the attacker was someone known to her. Investigators compared his past statements with the physical evidence. What he had said years earlier no longer aligned with the DNA results. His original account placed him away from the scene. The DNA placed him inside the apartment. That contradiction became the central turning point of the case. What had once been an unconfirmed possibility was now direct evidence. The person who had avoided detection for decades was finally identified. With the suspect identified, investigators reconstructed what happened inside the apartment. He had access to Roxanne's home, which explained the lack of forced entry. At some point, the interaction escalated into a violent confrontation. The signs of struggle matched close contact physical conflict. The biological evidence recovered in 1987 now confirmed his presence during that struggle. His earlier statement placing himself away from the scene was no longer credible. The timeline was corrected using the DNA evidence and known movements. What had once been uncertain was now supported step by step. The crime was not random, it was a direct interaction that turned violent. The evidence that existed from the beginning now fully explained the event. With the DNA match confirmed, the suspect was arrested and charged with the murder of Roxanne Wood. He denied involvement, maintaining that he had not been responsible for the crime. But the DNA evidence placed him directly inside the apartment during the violent struggle. Investigators showed that his earlier statement did not align with the physical evidence. That contradiction became central to the case against him. The prosecution relied heavily on the DNA match to prove his presence at the scene. The motive was not fully established, but the evidence showed a direct and violent interaction inside the apartment. This was not a random break-in. It was a crime involving someone she knew. The case moved forward without a confession, relying on forensic proof. He was ultimately convicted for the murder. Nearly 30 decades after the crime, the case was finally resolved. What had been missing was never the evidence, it was the ability to prove what it meant.